Good morning, patrons and friends. I'm fortunate enough to find myself at the magnificent Rattray wine estate at Somerset West in the Cape. I have done a story previously on this platform about Rattray, that estate that's situated far away. Indeed, it used to be a 12-hour horse ride from the castle in Cape Town to this estate Rattray, owned in its infancy by the Dutch East India Company and established initially by Willem Adrian van der Stel. We had a magnificent event here last night, opening the new Café Fleur in what used to be Camphor's restaurant, and what a fantastic evening it was. By the time you view this little video, I'm going to be on the west coast of Canada and Alaska. It's a region I absolutely love, always have, as does Karen. And working there on that run up from Anchorage, or rather from Vancouver all the way up to Anchorage or the port of Seward and back down again on expedition ships, is a quite special privilege. And I'm always amazed at how coincidences and life's path lead us to meeting points and then diverge again. Because isn't it wonderful to consider that Lord Carnarvon, who was the Secretary of State for Colonies, a man who had confederated Canada in 1867, wanted to do likewise with South Africa come 1877. And it was that confederation plan that the British felt the Zulu stood as a major stumbling block to, which is largely why the Anglo-Zulu War broke out. Lord Carnarvon was indeed the man who funded the expedition to Egypt, which found the tomb of Tutankhamun. I am also intrigued by the fact that Red Buller in his earlier days had been very involved in the Red River campaign with the voyageurs in Canada, and indeed then came out and established himself as a remarkable soldier and leader in the Anglo-Zulu War, earning his Victoria Cross at Joburg. Now, Canada and Alaska for me have always been lands of forest and mountain and lake and wide open spaces. Canada, as you probably know, has 5 time zones across it. It's a vast land. And so many South African medical staff, be they doctors or dentists, want to move out to Canada, and they're always told by the Canadian government that for their first 2 or 3 years they will be sent out to some very remote town or settlement before they get involved in the more mainstream Canadian societies and towns and cities. And a good friend of ours from Port Elizabeth moved out there with his family and was sent to a town way up in the northeast of British Columbia, where they had bears raiding the rubbish bins. Bears in the garden regularly, had to be careful with their young daughters. Deep snow in the winter time, where you've got to clear the snow from the doorways and the windows, and the houses are specially heated for that reason. They had a dog that loved the cold, and then would come into the house and get too warm as his coat, and he defrosted and all the ice and snow in his coat melted away and began to wet the floor, and then he'd go back outside to get cool again. And I am just delighted at the opportunity to be returning now to Canada and Alaska after lockdowns. COVID, unfortunately, I think is going to be with us for some time to come. But the fact that the cruise industry is returning to some degree of normality and we are able to return to work is just fantastic. You know, that city of Vancouver, the first time I went there, I arrived in a little beaten up minivan that I had done out for camping, and my plan was to drive the Alaskan-Canadian highway. And having bought the van in California, I had modified it for camping purposes and then drove it south down into Mexico, and then came up through Arizona, Nevada, Utah, Oregon and Washington, and then crossed the border into British Columbia and went to Vancouver. And what a magnificent city it is. Beautiful beaches. The city itself is fairly hilly, and then behind it running straight up into the mountains. As I always say in Vancouver, you can go from the beach to resorts where you can ski in little more than an hour. And of course, it's become incredibly cosmopolitan as times have changed with the change of government in 99 in Hong Kong, a huge number of wealthy Chinese people moved their assets and their wealth out of Hong Kong and China to Vancouver. So there's now a thriving, very wealthy Asian community in Vancouver, and it is a marvelous place to explore, to live. The feeling of excitement and Canadianness, for want of a better word, in Vancouver is just wonderful. And of course the Canadians are great people. I have a large number of friends in Canada. I worked during my 4-year sojourn abroad on the Alberta-Saskatchewan border at a place called Paradise Valley, which is very close to Lloydminster. And when I was at school, we had a young teacher who joined us for our English class, and she was asking us our names. And being teenagers and being a little bit stupid, everyone started to mess around with names. So the one kid said his name was Paul Kruger, in memory, of course, of the great Paul Kruger, president of the old Transvaal Republic. And the teacher was not pleased at all. And she remonstrated with this friend of mine, and she got to the next kid. And his name was Ferdinand Telescourt, which is quite an unusual name. And of course the teacher immediately thought he was pulling the mickey out of her too, but of course he wasn't. And what I remember most from that little experience in that English class was we had a beautiful exchange student from Canada who joined us. And Canadians, a bit like Americans, always give you the town that they live and the state. And this lovely young woman came from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Now, it's a difficult thing to say quickly. Saskatoon is a huge agricultural centre in Canada that makes some of the most magnificent agricultural equipment in the world in Saskatoon. But this girl gave her name and she said, I'm from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Well, the whole class packed up laughing. We didn't realise at the time that there was actually a place, a very well-known place, called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And when I was there, we spent the most incredible times driving with young chaps my age. We used to go to the rodeos. There was always ice and snow on the roads. Invariably, we were playing country music by our icon at the time called Shania Twain. And what a wonderful time we had with these chaps who'd embraced the winters. They used to hunt and fish, and skidoo and ski in the winter, and then they farmed in the summer. And on the farm where I worked, we used to have the cows calving down in a little enclosure with big lines of bales around them to try and stop the icy winds. And we always used to have to dry off the calves as soon as they were born to stop frostbite. And we had little beanie type fleece bags we used to put over the ears and over their tails, because invariably the ears and the tails, with the temperatures, could get frostbite and literally drop off. All the water troughs had a little element in the top that floated, a bit like a kettle element that was attached to an electrical supply to stop the water from freezing, that the animals could at least drink the water. And the tractors in the morning when we used to start them, we had gas heaters, and the vehicles were always parked indoors, and we would warm up the fuel tank and the fuel lines with gas heat, try and put some around the radiator and around the sump. They were always plugged in to an electrical supply with a heater that warmed the head, warmed the sump and warmed the radiator. And then we used to warm up the tyres, because the tyres on those heavy tractors, when they're standing on the floor, the bottom literally freezes flat, and when you drive off on that flat piece of the tyre. So we used to warm up the tyres to at least get the air a little bit more mobile, and that the tyre indeed resume a round shape rather than a square shape on one side, or a flat shape where it has frozen to the ground in position. So as I prepare to leave again on this very, very exciting time, it's bittersweet in many ways. Having spent 3 months in the Antarctic, December, January, February, was a very difficult time for us in terms of separation and time apart. Now I'm doing it again, largely obliged to do so because of the hole that's been left in our lives by COVID and lockdowns. And indeed I need to embrace this unique opportunity, because so many would love to go to the west coast of Canada and Alaska. We will see orcas, killer whales from the ships. We will see glaciers calving. We'll see those magnificent sea otters. We're going to go into all those early gold rush towns, and names like the Yukon and the Klondike, Saskatchewan, Juneau, Skagway pop up all the time, Prince Rupert, Glacier Bay. And indeed, I'm hoping to be fortunate enough to record some stories from that part of the world, and I'm hoping I can send them on Wi-Fi, perhaps from a coffee shop with good Wi-Fi, or make a plan to send them and share them with you. And I hope that you will continue to follow us and join us on the storytelling journey that takes me to some of the most beautiful places on earth, mindful that I'm going back to Antarctica in December, and what a treat it is to share these charmed, wonderful experiences with you. Thank you for your time.